Dow Chemical stands as one of America's great industrial empires, but also one of its most controversial. They didn't just build a company, they created a chemical empire from scratch. The founder, Herbert Henry Dow, started in 1897 with a revolutionary idea: extracting chemicals from brine. He single-handedly defeated the German monopoly. In just a few decades, Dow Chemical became fantastically powerful. They put their inventions into every American home. If you've ever used Saran wrap to keep food fresh, or a styrofoam container, you were touching what this empire built. By 1970, their company was worth $11 billion, nearly $90 billion today. But unlike other industrial families, the Dow's success was bound to a dark choice. When the Vietnam War exploded, they seized the opportunity. The Dows became the prime contractor supplying chemical weapons to the U.S. military. This was not a mistake. It was a business decision. They produced napalm, the weapon that burned everything it touched. And they produced millions of gallons of Agent Orange, the poison that sickened the land and the people for generations. The story of Dow Chemical is a hard lesson in how one name can represent both American innovation and the cruelty of war, and the price they paid for that choice. Herbert H. Dow, the company's founder, was the quintessential American opportunist. He began his career in 1897 not just as an inventor, but as a brawler, taking on the powerful German chemical cartel that held a global monopoly on bromine. In what became known as the Bromine War of 1910, the Germans dumped cheap bromine on the U.S. market to bankrupt him. Dow responded with ruthless genius. He secretly bought the cheap German bromine and then sold it back to Europe at a massive profit. He won. This established the company's DNA: aggressive, brilliant, and willing to engage in corporate warfare. When World War I began, Dow's opportunism pivoted to patriotism. The company became a key supplier of chlorine and phosgene gas for the U.S. military, establishing an early and lucrative relationship with the War Department. But this rapid expansion in Midland, Michigan, came at a high cost. Labor reports from the 1920s describe poor safety standards and a high rate of chemical accidents, a pattern of worker exploitation that mirrored other industrial giants of the era. When Herbert's son, Willard H. Dow, took over, this government relationship deepened. During World War II, Dow managed a $100 million government contract to produce magnesium, a vital component for aircraft. The project, according to 1940s Justice Department inquiries, was plagued by allegations of corruption and cost overruns. Simultaneously, Dow's production of styrene for synthetic rubber, a critical war material, was dumping PCBs into Michigan's Tittabawassee River, a toxic contamination that would poison the local population for 80 years. Willard, like his father, also worked closely with the state, collaborating with the OSS, the CIA's precursor, to develop new chemical weapons. To counter its growing reputation as a polluter, Dow launched a Safety First campaign in the 1920s and funded prestigious university research, like the Dow Institute at MIT. This public face of a responsible scientific innovator was a brilliant PR move, one that successfully masked the toxic reality of its manufacturing processes and the dangerous new path the company would take during the Cold War. When World War II ended, America and its industrial titans stood at the dawn of a new prosperous age. For Dow Chemical, the war had been a period of staggering growth, transforming it from a successful domestic company into an indispensable partner of the U.S. government. Under the leadership of Willard H. Dow, the founder's son, the company had proven its mastery over complex chemical production, from lightweight magnesium for aircraft to the synthetic styrene needed for rubber tires. The post-war era was not a time to slow down. It was a time to pivot this industrial might from the war effort to the American household. The results were astonishing. The company, which had a revenue of just $50 million in 1945, exploded. By 1960, it had shattered the $1 billion mark, a 20-fold increase in just 15 years. This was the era that made Dow a household name, a period when its chemical innovations, born from the labs that had served the military, were repurposed for peace. The most famous of these was a happy accident. In 1949, a scientist in a Dow lab was struggling with a new, stubbornly clingy material called polyvinylidene chloride. It was useless for its intended purpose, but it was brilliant for another. It was an almost perfect barrier to air and moisture. The company rebranded it, and Saran Wrap was born. By 1970, this transparent, indestructible film had captured 40% of the American food wrap market, according to Nielsen reports. It was a domestic revolution, a symbol of a new atomic age kitchen where food could be preserved indefinitely. But the company's true post-war dominance came not from the kitchen, but from the farm. Dow had been a leader in agricultural chemicals since its inception, but in the 1940s it began mass-producing a new miracle compound, DDT. Before its catastrophic environmental consequences were understood, DDT was hailed as a savior. It was the chemical that would wipe out malaria-carrying mosquitoes and save the world's crops from insects. Dow sold millions of pounds of it, becoming one of the primary suppliers of a chemical that would define the Green Revolution. This global expansion was fueled by a massive new industrial base. In 1940, Dow had built its Freeport, Texas plant. By 1970, Chemical and Engineering News reported it had become the largest ethylene production site in the world, churning out over 1 billion pounds a year. Freeport was the engine of Dow's empire, the place where the basic building blocks of the chemical age, chlorine, ethylene, and styrene, were produced on a scale the world had never seen. How did Dow achieve this total market domination? The company's strategy was a perfect three-pronged assault, a model of efficiency that combined technical brilliance, ruthless business tactics, and a deep, insidious political integration. The first pillar was vertical integration, a tactic Dow had mastered. Like its competitors, Dow understood the value of owning the entire production chain. But Dow took it a step further. While rivals like Monsanto might have to buy their precursor chemicals, Dow was the precursor. They owned the salt brine wells in Michigan. They owned the electrolysis plants that turned that brine into chlorine. They owned the factories that use that chlorine to make plastics, pesticides, and, fatefully, the components for napalm. This closed-loop system, as industry analysts noted, gave them a massive advantage. It slashed their production costs by an estimated 25% compared to competitors. They were insulated from market shocks and could outprice any rival. When the U.S. government came looking for a company to mass-produce complex chemical weapons, they found only one company that controlled every single piece of the supply chain, from the salt in the ground to the poison in the barrel. The second pillar was political integration. Dow was not just a contractor, it was a partner. Willard H. Dow had served as a trusted advisor to President Truman in the 1940s, helping to shape post-war industrial policy. This relationship was formalized under the next generation of leadership. CEO Leland Doan, who ran the company during the 1960s, understood that in the new Cold War era, the most important contracts were not commercial, but military. Dow became one of the most powerful and effective lobbyists in Washington. As documented by Open Secrets, the company was spending over $100,000 a year. In the 1970s, a massive sum for the time, to influence politicians, and more importantly, to embed itself within the Pentagon's procurement process. They didn't just bid on contracts, they helped write them. They positioned themselves as patriotic partners, the arsenal of democracy translated into chemical form. This political work paid off. It led directly to the third and most profitable pillar of their business, weaponization. In 1965, the Vietnam War was escalating. The U.S. military had a problem. The Viet Cong were invisible, hidden beneath a dense, triple canopy jungle. The solution was chemical. The military needed two things: a way to burn the jungle down and a way to kill the plants that provided cover. Dow's sales team, backed by its powerful political lobbyists, had the answer for both. The first was napalm. Napalm, a jellied gasoline, had existed since World War II, but Dow perfected it. They created Napalm B, a new, more stable mixture that was cheaper to produce, stuck to its targets more effectively, and burned longer and hotter. In 1965, Dow won the initial $5 million contract from the Department of Defense. It was a small, seemingly routine contract for a company of Dow's size, but this was just the beginning. As the war exploded, so did the demand for napalm. By 1967, Dow was the primary and soon the only producer of Napalm B for the U.S. military, eventually capturing 65% of the market. That small $5 million contract would swell into a financial windfall. According to Department of Defense reports, by 1973, Dow had produced 388,000 tons of the weapon. It was a roaring business success, but it was the second product that would truly define the company's legacy. The military didn't just want to burn the jungle. They wanted to kill it. They needed a defoliant, an herbicide of unprecedented power and scale. Again, Dow had the answer. Since the 1940s, Dow and other companies had been producing a powerful herbicide called 2,4,5-T. They knew from their own internal testing that this chemical was effective. They also knew, as internal documents would later prove, that a byproduct of its high-temperature manufacturing process was one of the most toxic substances known to science, dioxin. The U.S. military, desperate for a total defoliation solution, codenamed its program Operation Ranch Hand. The mission's motto was a chillingly direct, "Only you can prevent forests." They needed a chemical cocktail that could be sprayed from airplanes, one that would kill everything it touched. The solution was a 50-50 mixture of two herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. This mixture was given a color-coded name based on the barrels it was shipped in. It was called Agent Orange. In 1961, the U.S. government, through the Department of Defense, began issuing massive procurement contracts for Agent Orange. Dow Chemical, with its political connections and its total vertical integration, was in the perfect position to profit. They became the largest and most significant contractor for the program. U.S. Veterans Affairs reports would later confirm that Dow produced 11 million gallons of Agent Orange, accounting for 42% of the total supply, a contract worth tens of millions of dollars. This was the ultimate business tactic. Dow had successfully turned its expertise in agricultural chemicals into a multi-million-dollar military contract. But this decision was made with a terrible secret knowledge. This pattern of profiting from toxicity was not an isolated incident. It was a strategy that the company had been honing for decades. While Agent Orange was its most infamous product, its domestic operations were just as ruthless. Since the 1930s, Dow's Midland, Michigan plant had been producing a range of industrial chemicals, including PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. These miracle compounds were used in everything from electrical transformers to paints. They were also incredibly stable. meaning they did not break down in the environment. And they were, as Dow's own scientists knew, highly toxic. For decades, from the 1930s to the 1970s, Dow's factory systematically dumped PCB waste and other dioxin-related byproducts directly into the Tittabawassee River, the primary waterway for the entire region. The company's business model treated the river as a free private sewer. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, would later in the 1980s discover the horrific consequences. They found a dioxin plume extending for 50 miles downstream from the plant, contaminating the floodplains, the fish, and the homes of 10,000 local residents. Studies revealed a 25% increase in certain cancers and other diseases in the local population. The legal challenges that followed this discovery were a preview of the Agent Orange fight. Dow's lawyers engaged in a decades-long battle of denial and delay. They challenged the EPA's science. They argued that the dioxin was not that harmful or that it had come from natural sources like forest fires. It was the same playbook: deny the science, protect the profits, and delay accountability. This was the company that by 1965 had achieved total market dominance. It was a colossus built on a foundation of brilliant science and ruthless business. Its products like Saran wrap and styrofoam were in every home. Its agricultural chemicals were in every field. And its most profitable new products, napalm and Agent Orange, were now being unleashed on the jungles and villages of Vietnam. The rise of Dow Chemical was complete, built on a business strategy that was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible to the entire world. The Vietnam War was not just a ground war, it was a chemical war. It was a conflict where, in the eyes of U.S. military planners, the primary strategic challenge was the environment itself. The Triple Canopy Jungle was the enemy's greatest ally. It was a fortress that provided cover, a pantry that provided food, and a superhighway for troops and supplies. To win the war, the Pentagon decided they must first win the war against nature. This decision, born in the boardrooms of the RAND Corporation and the air-conditioned offices of the Pentagon, would unleash a chemical apocalypse on Southeast Asia. And the company that provided the tools for this apocalypse was Dow Chemical. Dow's two miracle products, napalm and Agent Orange, would become the defining symbols of the war's brutality. They were not just weapons, they were ecocide, tools designed to destroy the land's very ability to support life. The first and most visible of these was napalm. Napalm, a jellied gasoline, was a terror weapon. Its stated military purpose was to clear landing zones in the jungle and destroy enemy bunkers. But its psychological purpose was incineration, to create a wall of fire so terrifying it could break the enemy's will. Dow's Napalm B, the new formula they had perfected, was a chemical masterpiece. It was a mixture of polystyrene, a Dow invention, benzene, and gasoline. This new formula was superior to older napalms in every way. It was cheaper, it was more stable, and it was more cruel. It would stick to any surface, including human skin, and burn at over 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,500 degrees Celsius. It could not be extinguished. Water only made it burn harder. Trying to wipe it off only spread the fire. From 1965 to 1973, American B-52 bombers in missions like Operation Rolling Thunder dropped 388,000 tons of napalm, for which Dow was the primary producer on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The human cost was unimaginable. This was not a smart weapon. It was dropped from 30,000 feet, engulfing entire villages, rice paddies, and roads in a single indiscriminate sea of fire. Survivor accounts collected by the United Nations in 1972 are a vision of hell. They describe a rain of fire falling from the sky, a liquid flame that stuck to their children, their homes, their livestock. They describe people leaping into rivers only to find the napalm floating on the water's surface, still burning. The medical effects were catastrophic. Those who did not die instantly were left with third-degree burns across their bodies. The gel would melt flesh, fusing it to the bone. Dr. John Constable, a Harvard surgeon who volunteered in Vietnamese hospitals, described treating children whose faces had been melted into a single mass of scar tissue, their eyelids fused shut, their lips burned away. This was the weapon Dow was mass-producing in its American factories, and it was this weapon that, for the first time, brought the horror of the war directly into the American living room. In 1972, a young Associated Press photographer named Nick Ut was at the scene of a napalm strike on the village of Trang Bang. He saw a group of children running, screaming down a highway. Among them was a 9-year-old girl, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, who had ripped off her burning clothes. Her arms were outstretched, her mouth open in a silent scream. Ut's photograph, which would become known as the Napalm Girl, was transmitted around the world. It won the Pulitzer Prize. But more importantly, it did what years of protests had failed to do. It gave a human face to chemical warfare. It was the face of a 9-year-old girl, burned and running directly toward the camera. When asked about the image and about his company's role in creating the weapon that did this, Dow's CEO, Carl Gerstacker, gave the answer that would define the company's moral stance for decades. In 1967, he stated, "Our only crime is that we have been a prime contractor. We have a contract. We are not a moral entity." But the image of Kim Phuc was too powerful. The public pressure and the growing protest movement became too great. In 1969, Dow, seeing the public relations nightmare unfolding, chose not to renew its napalm contract. It was a business decision. The contract, which had swelled to over $100 million in total, had become more trouble than it was worth. But by then, the damage was done. Dow's name was, and would forever be, synonymous with the rain of fire. And yet, as horrific as napalm was, it was the second weapon that would inflict the most lasting generational damage. This was the silent weapon, Agent Orange. Agent Orange was the silent killer. While napalm announced itself with a roar and a fireball, Agent Orange arrived as a fine, oily mist, drifting down from C-123 Provider aircraft flying in low formation. The missions were codenamed Operation Ranch Hand, and their motto, a chilling corruption of Smokey Bear, was, "Only you can prevent forests." Between 1961 and 1971, these planes flew thousands of sorties, spraying 20 million gallons of tactical herbicides over South Vietnam. This chemical campaign, as documented by the Veterans Administration, destroyed 5 million acres of jungle and rice paddies, an area roughly the size of the state of Massachusetts. And the primary, most notorious component of this program was Agent Orange, the 50-50 mix of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. Dow Chemical was the largest and most significant producer, supplying 11 million gallons of the chemical to the U.S. military. The stated purpose was defoliation. The actual purpose was starvation and forced urbanization. By killing the jungle, the U.S. military eliminated the Viet Cong's cover. By killing the rice paddies, they eliminated their food source, forcing millions of rural peasants to flee the countryside and pile into squalid U.S.-controlled urban refugee camps. But this weapon of ecocide had a terrible secret, a secret that Dow Chemical knew and had concealed for years. The chemical 2,4,5-T, 1/2 of the Agent Orange mixture, was contaminated. The high-temperature process used by Dow to manufacture it created a toxic byproduct, tetrachlorobenzo-P-dioxin, or TCDD-dioxin. To call dioxin a poison is an understatement. It is one of the most toxic molecules ever synthesized by man. It is a powerful carcinogen, a hormone disruptor, and a teratogen, a substance that causes catastrophic birth defects. Dow knew. As far back as 1965, as the Agent Orange contracts were being ramped up, Dow's own internal scientists sent memos to management warning them that the levels of dioxin in their product were dangerously high. They warned that this was perhaps the most toxic molecule ever synthesized by man. The company was at a crossroads. They had two choices. They could implement a new low-temperature manufacturing process that would dramatically reduce the dioxin contamination, but it would be expensive and slow down production, putting the lucrative government contracts at risk. Or they could do nothing. Dow's management, in a decision that would come to define its moral legacy, chose to do nothing. They chose the business tactic of silence and willful ignorance. They continued to produce Agent Orange using the hot method, creating a product that was, by some estimates, contaminated with dioxin at levels thousands of times higher than was safe. They put this poison into orange-striped barrels and shipped it to the U.S. Air Force, never once disclosing the true, horrific nature of the contamination to the government or the soldiers who would be handling it. The tragedy in Vietnam unfolded in two waves. The first was the immediate impact on the landscape. The ranch hand planes would fly over, and within days the lush, vibrant green of the jungle would turn brown, then black. The leaves would fall, and the massive ancient trees would die, leaving behind a skeletal, haunted forest. The soil was poisoned. The animals that lived in the jungle died. The rivers that flowed through it were contaminated. The second wave was the human one. For the 3 to 4 million Vietnamese people who, according to the Vietnamese Red Cross, lived in the areas that were sprayed, the silent mist was a disaster. It settled on their homes, their water wells, and their crops. They drank the poisoned water, they ate the poisoned fish, and then the children began to be born. The dioxin entered the food chain and the human genome. The rates of miscarriages and stillbirths in the sprayed areas skyrocketed. And then came the birth defects, a parade of horrors that the local doctors had never seen. The Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange, VAVA, has documented the consequences. Children were born with 200% higher rates of severe birth defects. They were born with missing limbs, with cleft palates, with massive tumors, and with horrific neurological disorders. According to Vietnamese health organizations, hundreds of thousands of children have been born with these dioxin-related deformities. This was not a one-time event. Dioxin is a persistent chemical. It does not break down. It remains in the soil and the sediment of rivers for decades. Today, more than 50 years after the last spray mission, babies are still being born in Vietnam with the same signature birth defects. The tragedy is generational. But the Vietnamese were not the only victims. The poison was democratic. It did not care about uniforms. The 300,000 American soldiers who served in Vietnam were also exposed. They were the ground troops who walked through the defoliated forests. They were the pilots and crewmen of the C-123s who handled the chemical every day. They were the soldiers on bases where the barrels were stored, barrels that often leaked, covering the soil in a toxic film. These soldiers, as documented by the Veterans Administration, began to get sick. They returned home with strange, debilitating illnesses. They developed rare cancers like soft tissue sarcomas. They suffered from Parkinson's disease at rates 50% higher than the general population. And, like the Vietnamese, they watched in horror as their own children were born with the same inexplicable birth defects. This was the tragedy of Agent Orange. It was a weapon that, in its silent molecular cruelty, erased the distinction between the battlefield and the home, between the soldier and the civilian, between the present and the future. And as this dual tragedy of fire and poison unfolded, the reaction in America began to change. The anti-war movement, which had been a fringe protest, began to swell, and they found a new specific and corporate target. It wasn't just the government they were protesting, it was Dow Chemical. The anti-war movement in the United States did not begin as a protest against corporations. It began as a moral and political protest against the government's policy in Vietnam. But as the 1960s wore on, and the news from the front lines became more horrific, this began to change. The images of napalm and the growing awareness of chemical warfare provided a new tangible target for the movement's rage. The American University campus became the new front line. Students who were facing the draft and seeing their peers return in body bags began to question not just the politicians, but the entire system that supported the war. And they discovered that the system had a very clear corporate presence right on their own campuses. Dow Chemical's recruitment program. In the mid-1960s, Dow Chemical was one of the most desirable employers for young chemistry, engineering, and business graduates. Their campus recruiters would visit universities like Harvard, the University of Michigan, and the University of Wisconsin to find the best and the brightest. In 1966, this routine process became a flashpoint. Students, increasingly aware of Dow's role as the primary manufacturer of napalm, began to organize. The protest was no longer an abstract march in Washington. It was a direct confrontation. The slogan, "Dow makes napalm," became a rallying cry. At Harvard University in 1966, students staged one of the first major sit-ins against a corporate recruiter. When the Dow representative arrived on campus, he was met by hundreds of protesters who physically blockaded the interview room, effectively shutting down the recruitment drive. This tactic spread like wildfire. At the University of Wisconsin in 1967, a similar protest to block Dow recruiters exploded into violence. The university administration, caught between student outrage and their corporate partners, called in the city police. The resulting Dow riot saw police in riot gear use tear gas and clubs on their own students, a brutal confrontation that was broadcast on national news, further galvanizing the anti-war movement. At the University of Michigan, Dow's home state, the protests were especially personal. Students at the Michigan in the World exhibit have documented how thousands of students protested, burning their Dow recruitment cards in public and holding teach-ins about the chemical composition of napalm and the company's war crimes. This was a new kind of war, a war for public opinion, and Dow was losing it. The company's public relations response was a disaster. CEO Carl Gerstacker's 1967 statement that Dow was not a moral entity and was just fulfilling its contract was seen as the height of corporate arrogance. It confirmed everything the protesters were saying, that Dow was a faceless, amoral machine, profiting from human suffering. The protests had a real financial impact. By 1969, the constant negative press, the campus-wide boycotts, and the fact that their recruiters were now, quite literally, afraid for their physical safety, had taken a toll. Dow's board, according to Forbes, estimated the napalm contract, while profitable, was now a 5% loss in terms of its global brand damage and the immense cost of security. In 1969, citing business reasons, Dow announced it would not renew the napalm contract. It was a victory for the protest movement. They had successfully targeted a multi-billion-dollar corporation and forced it to change course. But the victory was hollow. While the protests had focused on the visible horror of napalm, the invisible horror of Agent Orange continued, largely unabated and unknown to the public, for 2 more years. The legacy of this period was profound. Dow's deadly inventions had not only caused a generational catastrophe in Vietnam, they had also fundamentally changed the nature of protest in America. The company had, against its will, taught an entire generation to see the link between corporate profit and military policy. The war would eventually end, but for Dow, the fight was just beginning. The napalm protests of the 60s would give way to the Agent Orange lawsuits of the 80s. And the student protests, once thought to be a relic of the Vietnam era, would find new life. As documented by the Yale Daily News in 2023, students today are still protesting Dow, not for napalm, but for its role in the climate crisis and its continued pollution. The deadly inventions of the Vietnam War had created an echo of protest that the company can still hear 50 years later. When the last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam in 1973, Dow Chemical and the American government believed the war was over. For them, it was a closed chapter, a series of fulfilled contracts, and a painful public relations episode that was best forgotten. But for the 291,000 American veterans who had served, the war was just beginning. They returned home not to ticker tape parades, but to a nation that wanted to forget. And they returned with a strange, invisible sickness. They were developing rare cancers, like soft tissue sarcomas, at alarming rates. Their skin was breaking out in a severe, disfiguring rash called chlorachin, the same ailment that had plagued Dow's own factory workers. They were suffering from neurological disorders, liver failure, and a deep, debilitating fatigue. And, in an echo of the horror in Vietnam, they were watching their children be born with inexplicable birth defects. These veterans, scattered across the country, began to connect the dots. They had all been in the name, and they had all been sprayed. They had walked through the defoliated skeletal forests. They had slept in the red dust. They had drunk the water. They had all, in their own way, been poisoned by the oily mist that came from the sky, the mist that came in barrels with an orange stripe. In 1979, the legal battle began. It started as a class action lawsuit filed by a handful of veterans. It would soon explode, becoming the largest and most complex product liability case in history. In Agent Orange product liability litigation. At the center of this legal storm, the primary defendant, the one with the deepest pockets and the most to lose, was Dow Chemical. Dow's immediate response was not one of compassion. It was one of total, aggressive legal warfare. The company, which had argued to students that it was not a moral entity, now set out to prove it. Their first tactic was denial. They argued with a straight face that there was no scientific evidence linking Agent Orange to the veterans' health problems. They dismissed the cancers, the chlorachin, and the birth defects as tragic but statistically normal coincidences. They claimed their product, 2,4,5-T, was one of the safest and most effective herbicides ever invented. Their second tactic was deflection. They argued that if there was any blame, it lay with the U.S. government. This was the government contractor defense. Dow argued that they were simply following orders. They had a contract. The government had ordered the chemical, specified the chemical, and in fact had been the one to spray it. How, they asked? Could a private company be held liable for a tactical decision made by the military in a time of war? It was a brilliant legal shield. It wrapped the corporation in the American flag, turning a product liability case into a question of national sovereignty and military authority. But this shield began to crack. The veterans' lawyers, led by a small, tenacious group, began the discovery process. They began demanding Dow's internal documents. And this is where the dioxin cover-up was exposed. Dow's lawyers fought tooth and nail to keep these documents sealed, claiming they were trade secrets. But in 1983, a judge in the New York court, Judge Jack B. Weinstein, forced their hand. He unsealed the memos. The documents were a smoking gun. They proved, in Dow's own words, that the company had known about the dioxin contamination since at least 1965. The memos, as detailed by corpresearch.org, showed that Dow's own scientists had warned management that their product was contaminated with the most toxic chemical we have ever encountered. They proved that the company had known about the chloracin in their own workers. Most damning of all, they proved that Dow had actively concealed this information from the U.S. government, while the company's lawyers were in court arguing that they were just following orders. These memos proved that they had known the orders were for a product that was infinitely more toxic than the government understood. They had known the poison in their product was a secret, and they had kept it that way to protect their multi-million-dollar contracts. The cover-up was out. The press was having a field day. Dow was no longer a patriotic contractor. It was a cynical poisoner. With their legal defenses crumbling and a jury trial looming, a trial that would see thousands of dying veterans and their deformed children paraded in front of a jury, Dow and the other 6 chemical companies, including Monsanto and Diamond Shamrock, were forced to the negotiating table. On May 7, 1984, in a marathon last-minute session, they reached a deal. Judge Weinstein, eager to avoid a trial that could clog his court for a decade, pushed both sides into a settlement. The chemical companies agreed to pay $180 million into a fund for the 291,000 veteran plaintiffs. It was, at the time, the largest class action settlement in history. For the veterans, it felt like a victory. They had forced one of the most powerful corporations in the world to pay, but for Dow, it was a financial masterpiece. First, the $180 million was a bargain. Dow's share was $93 million, a sum that, while large, was a fraction of their annual profits. It was a manageable business expense. Second, and most importantly, the settlement contained no admission of liability. Dow paid the money, but they were not, in the eyes of the law, guilty of anything. They continued to publicly maintain that Agent Orange was safe and that the settlement was merely a humanitarian gesture. The $180 million, when divided among 291,000 plaintiffs over a decade, amounted to almost nothing. The average veteran received a few $1,000s. A widow of a soldier who had died of cancer might receive $5,000. It was not justice. It was an insult. Dow had successfully and cynically calculated the exact price of the American veterans' suffering. The 1984 settlement with American veterans was a cynical but brilliant act of legal containment. Dow had successfully cordoned off the domestic threat. But as the 1990s and 2000s unfolded, a new and far larger group of victims began to demand justice: the Vietnamese. For decades, the victims in Vietnam, the millions suffering from cancers, and the hundreds of thousands of children born with horrific deformities had no voice. They were citizens of a former enemy state, isolated by politics and poverty, their suffering largely invisible to the Western world. That changed in 2004. In a landmark legal battle, the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange, VAVE, representing millions of Vietnamese plaintiffs, filed a class action lawsuit in the same New York court where the veterans had settled. This time, the defendants were Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and the other manufacturers. The VAVA lawsuit was not just a plea for compensation. It was a demand for historical justice. The plaintiffs argued that the use of Agent Orange, particularly with its known dioxin contamination, was not a legitimate act of war. They argued it was a war crime, a violation of international protocols like the Geneva Convention, which prohibits the use of chemical weapons, especially those that do not distinguish between soldiers and civilians and cause superfluous injury. This lawsuit put Dow in a terrifying new legal jeopardy. If a U.S. court agreed that Agent Orange was a chemical weapon, the government contractor defense would evaporate. A company cannot be ordered to commit a war crime. Dow's legal team, faced with this existential threat, deployed their most powerful and ruthless tactics. Their primary strategy was jurisdictional. They argued, as they had in the Union Carbide case, that a U.S. court was the wrong forum. They also argued that the Vietnamese plaintiffs, as citizens of a foreign communist government, had no standing to sue in an American court. But their most chilling argument was a direct assault on the war crime claim. Dow's lawyers, in an argument that shocked international observers, stated that the Geneva Protocol did not apply to herbicides. They argued that Agent Orange was technically just a very strong weed killer. Its purpose was to kill plants, not people. The fact that millions of people were poisoned, got cancer, and had deformed children was, in their legal framework, an unfortunate but incidental consequence of a legitimate military operation. Furthermore, they argued that since the U.S. government itself had never ratified the 1975 update to the Geneva Protocol, which explicitly banned herbicides in warfare, their actions were perfectly legal at the time. In 2005, Judge Jack B. Weinstein, the very same judge who had presided over the veterans' 1984 settlement, ruled on the case. He dismissed the Vietnamese lawsuit in its entirety. He agreed with Dow. He ruled that Agent Orange was not a poison under international law. He accepted the government contractor defense, ruling that the companies were not liable for the military's use of their product. And in a final devastating blow, he ruled that the 1984 Veterans Settlement had, in effect, already settled the issue of Agent Orange's toxicity, and no new claims could be brought. The ruling was a total victory for Dow Chemical. The U.S. legal system had officially declared that the poisoning of 3 million Vietnamese civilians and the generational legacy of birth defects was not a crime. It was a political question, not a legal one. The appeal was subsequently rejected in 2008. While Dow was winning this total victory in the courtroom, it was still losing the war for public opinion, which was being waged on the same university campuses that had erupted 2 decades earlier. The anti-Dow protest movement, which had been born from the napalm boycotts of 1966, did not die after the war. It simply evolved. The students of the 1960s and 70s had successfully made Dow a pariah, forcing it to withdraw its recruiters from over 50 universities, including its home state school, the University of Michigan, in 1967. But the students of the 2000s and 2010s inherited this legacy. For them, Dow was not just a war criminal. It was now one of the world's largest corporate polluters. They protested Dow for the dioxin plume in the Tittabawassee River. They protested Dow for its massive carbon footprint and its role in climate change. They protested Dow for its acquisition of Union Carbide in 2001, a move that made Dow legally responsible for the Bhopal disaster, which it continued to deny. The lawsuits and the protests, while failing to secure a legal victory, had succeeded in one thing. They had permanently fused the name Dow with the concepts of dioxin, pollution, and corporate malfeasance. The company's legal scandals and the public's protest movement had become a permanent, self-perpetuating feedback loop. Every time Dow's lawyers won in court by denying science, the public's outrage grew. This created a massive systemic problem for the company's brand. The name Dow was toxic. This reputational crisis was not just a public relations problem. It was a direct threat to the company's future. Dow's entire business model relied on recruiting the next generation of top-tier scientists, chemists, and engineers from the world's best universities. But the protest movement, born in 1966 and re-energized in the 2000s, was actively working to sever that pipeline. The scandals had become cumulative. Students at universities like Yale, Harvard, and the University of Michigan were no longer just protesting Agent Orange. They were protesting a corporate entity they saw as fundamentally corrupt. A 2023 protest at Yale University, as documented by the Yale Daily News, showed how deep this generational anger ran. Students were protesting Dow's sponsorship of environmental and scientific programs at the university. They argued that accepting Dow's money was greenwashing, a cynical attempt by the company to use Yale's prestige to launder its reputation. They were protesting the Tittabawassee River dioxin plume in Michigan, a contamination Dow had hidden for decades and was still fighting in court to avoid cleaning up. They were protesting Dow's climate change footprint, as the company remained one of the world's largest producers of plastics and greenhouse gas-emitting chemicals. And, crucially, they were protesting Dow's 2001 acquisition of Union Carbide. This single business deal, which Dow saw as a strategic merger, was seen by the activists as a moral catastrophe. It meant that Dow, the company that poisoned Vietnam, had now also become the company that had gassed Bhopal. Dow, by acquiring Carbide, had inherited its legal and moral responsibility for the 1984 Bhopal disaster, a responsibility it was fighting in Indian courts with the same tactics of denial and delay it had used for Agent Orange. The scandal was now complete. The legal battles over Agent Orange had not delivered justice, but they had successfully exposed Dow's playbook. They had proved the company's willingness to conceal scientific data, to lie to the government, and to prioritize profit over human life. The 1984 Veterans Settlement, which Dow's lawyers saw as a victory, had become a public relations disaster in perpetuity. It was a $180 million admission of guilt, no matter what the fine print said. The failed 2004 Veava lawsuit, while a legal win for Dow, was a moral disaster. It cemented Dow's image as a corporate bully that would hide behind legal technicalities to avoid facing the children it had deformed. The protest movement, which had once been a small group of students chanting, "Dow makes napalm," had metastasized. It was now a global, multi-generational, and multi-issue campaign. It was a coalition of American veterans, Vietnamese victims, Indian activists from Bhopal, and American environmentalists from Michigan. Dow had created a global alliance of its own victims. The scandals, from the 1960s to the 2020s, had all merged into a single damning narrative. The company was no longer just a prime contractor. It was, in the eyes of the public, the world's most sophisticated and successful chemical poisoner. The relentless, decades-long assault on Dow's public image was not just a corporate problem. It was a deeply personal one. The men who ran the company were not anonymous, faceless executives. They were the leaders of a company that for a time was the most hated corporation in America, and they and their families became personal targets. The personal tragedies of the Dow dynasty begin with its founder. Herbert Henry Dow, the brilliant, combative entrepreneur, had poured his entire life into his company. He had fought the Bromine War and supplied the First World War. He was a man, according to his 1930 biography, who was defined by relentless stress and ambition. He died in 1930 at the age of 64, not from a chemical accident, but from cirrhosis of the liver, a death his contemporaries linked to the immense crushing pressure of building his chemical empire. His son, Willard H. Dow, inherited this burden. Willard successfully guided the company through the Great Depression and the massive expansion of World War II. He was the one who managed the secret magnesium and styrene contracts. He was the one who collaborated with the OSS. He was, by all accounts, as driven as his father. In 1949, Willard Dow was killed. His death was not in a boardroom. It was in a fiery plane crash, in a winter storm, while on his way to a business meeting. The man who had built a chemical empire dedicated to war had died, in a sense, in service to it. But the most public and most visceral personal tragedy was that of Carl Gerstacker. Gerstacker was CEO during the 1960s, the man at the helm when the napalm contracts were signed and the student protests exploded. He was the one who had to answer for the napalm girl. He became, for a generation of anti-war protesters, the human face of the merchants of death. Gerstacker was not a reclusive figure. He was a proud public-facing CEO, and as a result, he became a personal target. He wasn't just protested, he was hunted. As documented in PBS's American Experience in 1968, Gerstacker, a proud alumnus of the University of Michigan, was on a college campus to give a speech. He was met by a mob of students. They didn't just shout slogans, they pelted him with paint bombs and physically chased him off the campus. He was, in his own words, shaken. He was a pillar of the American establishment, and he was being treated like a criminal. This personal, visceral rejection by the very generation he was trying to recruit was a profound blow, one that was reportedly instrumental in the 1969 decision to finally drop the napalm contract. This relentless pressure had a profound long-term effect on the corporation. The company's name, Dow, was now toxic. It was a liability. This led to a series of internal disputes and ultimately a strategic dissolution of the very identity the Dow family had built. The first crack came from within. The 1984 Agent Orange settlement, which the company had celebrated as a legal victory, was a disaster for its shareholders. In the wake of the settlement, a shareholder lawsuit was filed, as documented by corpresearch.org, accusing the company's management of breaching their fiduciary duty. The shareholders argued that management knew about the dioxin risks and had hidden them not just from the government, but from their own investors. This reckless, immoral decision had now exposed the company to billions in liability, tanked the stock price, and permanently damaged the brand. Dow, to avoid another public trial, quietly settled this shareholder suit for $10 million. The company was now paying fines for its own cover-up. But the real threat came from a new generation of investors. By the 2000s, the conglomerate model that Dow had perfected was out of fashion. Wall Street no longer wanted a single massive company that did everything. They wanted specialized, lean companies. And they saw Dow, with its massive, complex portfolio of plastics, agricultural chemicals, and industrial products, as a fat, slow-moving target. In 2014, a new kind of enemy appeared, the activist investor. A hedge fund named Third Point, run by the notoriously aggressive billionaire Daniel Loeb, took a massive stake in Dow. Loeb's argument was simple. Dow's leadership was incompetent. The company's stock was underperforming, and the only way to unlock value was to do what Dow's own internal logic had always resisted: break the company into pieces. This was a personal tragedy for the Dow corporate identity. Third Point demanded that Dow spin off its profitable plastics and petrochemical divisions from its slower agricultural division. This was a war for the soul of the company. Dow's management, led by CEO Andrew Liveris, fought back, but the pressure was too intense. This investor pressure forced Dow into the most dramatic move in its history. To survive, they had to merge. In 2017, in a $130 billion merger of equals, Dow Chemical merged with its oldest and largest rival, DuPont. The new entity, DowDuPont, became the largest chemical company in the world, with a combined revenue of $86 billion. This merger was hailed as a triumph of strategic vision, but in reality, it was a capitulation. It was the solution that Third Point had demanded. The merger was not an end. It was a means to an end. The entire purpose of the merger was to create a company so large that it could be efficiently and profitably dismantled. And that is exactly what happened. Just 2 years later, in 2019, the DowDuPont entity was officially broken apart. It was split into 3 new specialized companies: DuPont, Specialty Materials; Corteva, the agricultural business, including the Agent Orange legacy; and a new company that would inherit the core commodity chemical business. The name they gave this new company? Dow Incorporated. The dissolution was complete. The company that Herbert Dow had built, the massive integrated conglomerate that had supplied wars and revolutionized the American kitchen, was gone. It had been dismantled not by protesters, but by its own shareholders, by the very capitalist logic of profit that it had championed. The new Dow Inc., which emerged in 2019, was a ghost. It was a $45 billion company, but it was a shadow of the integrated colossus Herbert Dow had built. The original Dow Chemical, the company that had produced both the Saran wrap for the kitchen and the Agent Orange for the jungle, was dead. It had been killed by activist investors who saw its sins not as a moral problem, but as a financial inefficiency. This corporate dissolution was the final personal tragedy for the Dow legacy, but it was also the ultimate corporate response. Faced with a name that was, in the public mind, synonymous with napalm, dioxin, and Bhopal, the company had been fighting a losing war for its own reputation for 50 years. The protests, the lawsuits, and the shareholder revolts had all taken their toll. The brand was toxic. In 2006, in the years before the final dissolution, the company had launched its most expensive and cynical attempt to solve this problem. It was a $100 million advertising campaign called The Human Element. This campaign was a masterpiece of public relations and a chilling window into the company's soul. The ads were beautiful, minimalist, and profound. They showed children, teachers, and doctors. They featured the periodic table, but with a new 118th element added: who? The human element. The slogan was, "What is the human element? It is the most important element of all. It is what drives us. It is the element that, when combined with the elements of science, can solve the world's problems. At Dow, we are looking for the human element." This was not just an advertisement. It was a corporate exorcism. After 50 years of being told they were an immoral entity, a merchant of death, that had gassed Vietnam and Bhopal, Dow's response was to rebrand humanity itself. They were attempting to co-opt the very concept of humanism that the protesters had used against them. They were saying that they were the true humanists, the ones using science to solve human problems like clean water and climate change. The $100 million campaign was a desperate, brilliant attempt to wash the blood off the name Dow. It was an effort to make the public forget napalm, to forget Agent Orange, to forget the Tittabawassee River, and to forget the children of Vietnam and Bhopal. It was a public declaration that the new Dow was a moral entity after all. This PR campaign was the sister strategy to the final corporate dissolution. The company was fighting a war on two fronts. On Wall Street, it was dismantling its physical body to appease investors. And on television, it was spending $100 million to build itself a new soul. The final corporate response, therefore, was not one of accountability. It was one of obfuscation. To the American veterans, the company's response was the $84 million it contributed to the 1984 settlement fund, a sum they still describe as a humanitarian gesture, not an admission of guilt. To the people of Vietnam, the company's response has been a wall of silence. Dow has consistently refused to pay a single dollar in compensation to the Vietnamese victims. They hide behind the 2005 U.S. court ruling that declared Agent Orange was not a poison. To this day, Dow's official position is that their only role was fulfilling a government contract, and that the responsibility for the cleanup and the health care of the victims lies solely with the U.S. and Vietnamese governments. The personal tragedy of Carl Gerstacker being pelted with paint bombs had evolved into the corporate tragedy of a company so haunted by its own past it was forced to legally and financially kill itself, only to be reborn as a new entity, Dow Inc. This new entity, cleansed by Wall Street spin and a $100 million PR campaign, continues to operate, its human element logo now standing as the final cynical monument to the millions of human lives its predecessor destroyed. The sheer scale of the Agent Orange tragedy and the depth of the corporate cover-up has fueled decades of conspiracy theories. The most potent of these, as detailed in documents unsealed in the 1984 veterans' lawsuit, is hardly a theory. It is the documented fact that Dow's management knew about the dioxin contamination in the 1960s, and some evidence suggests as early as the 1940s, and actively concealed it from the government to protect their contracts. Other rumors persist of a deeper link, a collaboration with the CIA in developing chemical weapons that went far beyond mere contracting. But the true global influence of Dow Chemical is not a secret plot. It is a public, historical fact. Dow's production of napalm and Agent Orange was so horrific, it fundamentally changed international law. The images of Kim Phuc and the data from Vietnam were a direct catalyst for the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, which banned the use of such agents in warfare. The company's deadly inventions had in effect forced the world to draw a new moral line in the sand. Its domestic influence was just as profound. Dow's funding of university programs, such as the Dow Chemical Endowments at over 50 U.S. schools, ensured its influence on the next generation of scientists, even as protesters gathered outside. Ultimately, historians, as noted by sources like PBS and Britannica, argue that a simple conspiracy narrative misses the point. The Dow tragedy was a systemic failure. It was the inevitable result of a system that prioritized wartime production and corporate profit above all else. Dow's legacy is not a mystery. It is a painful lesson in corporate responsibility versus wartime ethics. This lesson led directly to the 2001 Stockholm Convention, a global treaty that specifically banned the persistent organic pollutants, POPs, that Dow had championed, including dioxin and PCBs. The fight continues as modern BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, movements on college campuses today prove that for a new generation, the name Dow is still synonymous with the poison it unleashed.